Funding for Encuentros is provided in part by Sempra Energy and Loose Forward, Cross-Border Council for the Californias.
Welcome to this special session of Encuentros, U.S. Diplomacy and the Challenge of Political Change in Latin America. This program is being presented to you by the Institute of the Americas and by the American Academy of Diplomacy. My name is Jeffrey Davidow. I'm president of the Institute of the Americas. The Institute is a not-for-profit organization located on the campus of the University of California, San Diego. Our goal is to promote dialogue and discussion in this country and throughout the hemisphere on issues of important public policies. We do this by programs such as this and by programs in Latin American countries where we discuss energy issues, telecommunications, good governance, e-government, and a host of other issues. I suggest that you check us out at www.iamericas.org. Our guests this evening are three distinguished, retired American Foreign Service officers, each with more than 30 years of experience, most of that experience in Latin America. You have in the pamphlet you were given their brief bios. Let me just say that Ambassador Charles Tony Gillespie served in many capacities. Chief of Mission in Grenada, Ambassador to Colombia, Ambassador to Chile. Alec Watson, served as Ambassador to Peru and was also Assistant Secretary of State for Latin America, the highest policymaker in the State Department and the coordinator of U.S. government activities in Latin America. And David Greenlee has had numerous positions. Most recently, and until just a few months ago, ambassador to Bolivia. He also served as ambassador to Paraguay. He also served as the special coordinator for Haiti, which also, of course, is in the Western Hemisphere. I'd like at this time to ask Tony Gillespie to say a few words about the American Academy of Diplomacy, which is a co-sponsor of this event. Tony?
Thank you, Jeff. About the same time that Ted Gildred was putting together or making real his idea of the Institute of the Americas, a group of distinguished American diplomats put together something called the American Academy of Diplomacy. Its mission is the pursuit of excellence in American diplomacy and the improvement of public understanding in this country of the importance of diplomacy for our security and for our prosperity. We have approximately 100 members, regular members. It is a selective organization. The membership recruits replacements as vacancies occur. Each member has to have served in at least 2 positions, senior positions in American diplomacy. We are a mixture of both career foreign service and non-career diplomats. We're delighted to team with Jeff and the Institute to put on this program. David is hardly retired from the Foreign Service, so he's not eligible. He's still, at least officially, on active duty, but both Alec and Jeff are members of the Academy. It's a pleasure to be here. Jeff, back to you.
Well, what are we talking about this evening? I think all of us are aware that something's going on in Latin America, at least if we judge by the headlines in the newspaper. For the first time in quite a number of years, Latin America, or the events in Mexico and Brazil and Venezuela and Bolivia and other countries, are actually being reported on. You know, we've all gone through long periods of time where nothing seems to matter about what happens in Latin America, but now there is an effervescence something's going on. And we have to make sense of that. The role of U.S. diplomats and U.S. diplomacy is critical in our understanding of events and in trying, at the same time, to influence those events. The role of the diplomat of any country is to try to get people in governments of other countries to understand one's own policies and, wherever possible, to act in a cooperative fashion. That is essentially why we have American embassies in almost every country of the world, why we have diplomats, why we have people often serving at great risks to themselves. Our goal as diplomats is to make life better for the American people. Now, if that sounds a bit brusque, I'm sorry, but we are public servants, and our goal is to pursue the national interests of the United States. I think, speaking for myself and for everybody else on the panel, we think that we can pursue those national goals in concert with other nations, and especially with the other nations in Latin America, who we have no natural animosity with, and who we should be able to work together, we helping them and they helping us. And that's the job of diplomats. So one of the things we're going to talk about this evening is, what do these fellows do when they're in the field? When they're in the field, I mean, not in the field digging, but in the field in their embassies. Some of them go into the field and dig, but let's talk a bit about some of the general outlines of what we see in Latin America today and gets reflected in the press. And I'll give you my perspective, which almost assuredly will not be the perspective of the other three. It does seem to me that we have entered a new phase in Latin American political development. In this phase, which is one of increased political tension in some countries, political conflict in some countries, open anti-Americanism in at least one major country, that's Venezuela, is new in the sense that if we take a step back and look at what happened in Latin America, particularly during the 1990s, we see that there was a very important sea change. The Latin America of the mid-1990s was not the Latin America of the mid-1970s, which was a continent largely ruled by military governments with outdated ideas of economic development. By the mid-1990s, Latin America had by and large chosen the path of democratic government, that is, free elections, and market economies, that is, economies in which the private sector played a predominant or very important role alongside the state to help promote economic development. This was a very important change, a sea change. And several of the people here, Tony Gillespie, who was the State Department coordinator for the Summit of the Americas, which was the first time in many years, at the end of 1994, that all the presidents of Latin America got together in Miami, and for the first time in many years, every state was represented, every country was represented, because they were all democratic states. The only Latin American country, or the only hemispheric country, I should say, because the English-speaking countries were there as well. The only one that wasn't there was Cuba, because it was the only non-democracy in the hemisphere. Compare that to what the situation had been just 10 or 20 years before. Richard Feinberg, who was a professor here at UCSD, was instrumental working in the White House on that same program. Well, Latin America adopted policies that led to increased democracy, greater public discussion, at the same time that its political elites and economic elites adopted economic policies that led to greater integration with the world and greater dependency on the free market. As we moved into the 2000, 2002, 2003, we started to see a reaction The increased democracy in Latin American states allowed populations to vent their frustrations, because in many of these states, the citizenry had been told that with democracy and free markets and open economies and end to government subsidies and selling off wasteful government businesses, government-owned businesses, the economies would grow and there would be more to go around for everyone else. Well, the truth of the matter is that economically, it really hasn't worked that well. Inequality of income remains higher in Latin America than in any other region of the world except Africa. About 50% of the population of Latin America lives in poverty. And about 25% of the population lives in abject poverty. They are the poorest of the poor. And given the opportunity that they've had now with increased democracy to voice their frustrations, we see that developing. And we see in country after country the growth of leftist candidates, of populist candidates, some of whom are saying that this model that we adopted in the 1990s just isn't working. Some are saying, let's go back to where we were before. But the interesting point, and this will be the last point I make, is that for the most part, throughout Latin America, notwithstanding the rhetoric of the leadership or the political elites, the lessons of the 1990s have stuck. What do I mean? Most governments, and take a look at Brazil, for instance, which has a leftist president, someone who's come out of the labor union tradition, who was just reelected, and who obviously is committed to improving life for the poor. But in Brazil, he has maintained very conservative fiscal management. He has not gone back to the old spend and populist ways of the past. Democracy is fully in force. And this is happening in country after country. So one of the things that we have to do, it seems to me, as diplomats and as citizens who want to know what's happening, is separate the wheat from the chaff, separate a lot of the rhetoric from the reality. The reality is that there has been progress in Latin America. People are freer. They have more opportunities. Their economies have more opportunity to grow. The bad part is that they haven't grown sufficiently, and poverty has not been adequately dealt with in most countries. So in that context, the political game gets played out. And each of the three panelists has seen this play out. And I would ask them to give us some comments for a few minutes based on their own experiences, what they have seen recently or in the past, how their perspective, which may be very different from mine, can help us as Americans do two things. One, understand what's happening so we are better able to cope with it. And two, to understand what the role of American diplomats and American diplomacy is. Now I'm going to ask David Greenlee to begin, because David has just come from, at least figuratively, one of the hottest spots in Latin America. That is La Paz, Bolivia. Actually, at 13,000 feet, it's not very hot. But in terms of what is happening in that society, we are seeing a lot of the forces that I've discussed come together. And David, why don't you talk for a few minutes about your most recent experiences, and if you want, tie them in to some of the things you've seen in other countries in the past.
Well, Jeff, thanks for your very eloquent introduction. Also, I want to thank your institute and the American Academy of Diplomacy for including me in this event. As Tony Gillespie noted, I'm not quite out of the State Department. Another couple of weeks I will be. But with that disclaimer, I want to say that what I'm going to talk about are perspectives that I fully agree with. I had a lot to do with shaping a policy toward Bolivia after the election of Evo Morales a year ago in December. And I'm very comfortable the way we're approaching that particular challenge. I'd also like to note that, and again, I'm going to really come at this from the perspective of having spent some time in Bolivia, first as a Peace Corps volunteer in the mid-60s, then twice in the Foreign Service before I became ambassador in January 2003. From January 2003 to mid-September 2006, I went through I didn't go through the last one, but four different presidents. All of those presidents rotated one way or the other within the framework of democracy. Now, I had the honor to serve in Ambassador Paul Boker's embassy from 1977-79, much of that time also with Alec Watson, who was the Deputy Chief of Mission. From November of 1977 until I left that embassy in December of 1979, there were 2 full sets of elections, 1 annulment of elections, 3 coups, and I think 7 presidents. If you So I don't want to just say that this is progress, but I do want to say that the Bolivia of today is nothing at all like the Bolivia of 1977 or the Bolivia when I was there as a Peace Corps volunteer in the mid-1960s. There is, though, something that hasn't changed enough, and that is the inclusion of the indigenous poor in the political process and the economic and social processes of the country. There was a very significant Bolivian revolution in 1952 that did grant the indigenous peoples political rights, peoples who had been basically in chattel servitude until 1952. But they did not really get into the system. And while their vote was needed and used by political parties, the parties didn't deliver enough of what was needed to them to make them feel that they were part of what needed to happen in Bolivia. The frustration they felt boiled over in October of 2003 around a hydrocarbons issue, whether Bolivia should export its gas through Chile to the United States, or whether Bolivia should somehow get control of its gas and industrialize it, use it first in the country. That was the banner of the conflict in October 2003. The president was forced out. Vice president stepped up. He lasted a year and a half. He stepped down. The head of the Supreme Court came in again constitutionally and presided over elections, which was his sole role. And an indigenous president, Evo Morales, was elected. Now, I would submit that this is not indicating any breakdown in democracy. This is democracy at work. Evo Morales was not clearly our preferred candidate. We were very careful how we handled the election process. We did not state our preferences, but clearly he was not it. He was a coca leader, coca producer from a region of Bolivia that grows non-traditional coca that goes 85, 90, 95% to the production of cocaine. So we didn't like what was happening in his base area. And over the years, when he was a coca leader, there were people who made comments about him, about his role as a coca leader, which turned him virulently against the United States. But why was he elected? He was elected because the political parties were not delivering the goods for the indigenous poor and for Bolivia. In 40 years, looking back, other countries in the region have grown. Bolivia, in real economic terms, has grown less than 1%. Something's not working. And it's not just the neoliberal model, because it didn't work under the more statist model before that. And I don't know, maybe it won't work under the return to a more state-centric model that they're trying to implement now. But it hasn't hasn't worked, and that previously eroded democracy, and let's face it, it could erode democracy again, even though there's new hope that things will change if the economic side doesn't come together. But Evo Morales won by a landslide because people were tired of the old parties, tired of corruption, and the indigenous poor, who had been largely rural 40 years ago, 50 years ago, were now largely urban and able to act. So this is, I think, democracy at work. It's not the kind of democracy we're used to. Democracy didn't deliver the goods, in part because of the weakness of institutions. Bolivians don't appeal to institutions when things aren't going right. They get frustrated with institutions. They go out in the street, they demonstrate, they tie up traffic, miners throw dynamite, and it's a daily occurrence in Bolivia. Someplace in Bolivia, every day there will be a demonstration. When I was in La Paz the first year, they did a tally of demonstrations the previous year, and I think it was something like 2 a day. So Bolivians act out, they demonstrate because the institutions don't deliver. And that creates an environment for a populist kind of leader. There's a wonderful line in one of the books about Egypt, about Gamal Nasser. I think the title of one of the chapters was A Role in Search of an Actor. If ever there was a role in search of an actor, it was the situation of a country 65% self-described as indigenous, and a country where 65% of the population lives below the poverty line, and they're really the same people. They have access to the vote, and they can be organized into political groups that can elect the leader they want. They elected for change, and our challenge is to work with this very complicated president who comes out of a side of Bolivia that we have issues with, but and also has friends that we have issues with, Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez, but is a guy who found his way up in a very, very complicated political environment, and who is a very shrewd, instinctive politician, and who over time has made deals for stability in favor of his political interests. And our hope and expectation through positive engagement, and that's what we're doing, is that he can succeed as a democratic, increasingly institutional president who understands that if Bolivia is going to grow, it's going to have to attract investment, and who understands the United States is not trying to bring him down or democracy down. On the contrary, we're trying to make it work.
If you look around the world, the United States can look at Latin America and be reasonably comfortable. It is, in the sense of state-to-state conflict, the most peaceful area on the planet. There are no conflicts between states of any significance right now that are likely to burst into flames. There are differences on borders here and there, but nothing that's likely to burst into warfare. Military budgets all over the hemisphere are decreasing. The only countries with significant increases in military spending in the last few years have been Venezuela, for obvious reasons, under Mr. Chavez, and the Chileans. And the Chilean armed forces are in a special circumstance because they receive virtually off-budget a percentage of revenue from the copper industry there. And so they can afford to buy some new equipment. But most of the other armed forces are diminished in stature and in political influence, as Jeff suggested. I think that the hemisphere has changed dramatically in the last few years. As Jeff said, the everybody agrees to democracy. That's one of the things that we did really at the Summit of the Americas that Richard and Tony and I and a bunch of us worked on in Miami in 1994. Basically what we were doing there is we were drawing a line under progress that had been made on a variety of fronts. I'll mention those in a minute, and then setting some objectives and goals for what we might do in the future to advance down those paths. One was we all committed ourselves to democratic political forms, and this was ratified further with the Democratic Charter in the Organization of American States a few years later. Now, this doesn't mean every democracy is perfect, but it means you start with electoral democracy and respect for human rights and respect for the minority, and you move from there. Secondly, everybody basically agreed, as Jeff suggested, that we should have market economies as opposed to state economies. A lot of those, the elements of this eventually came to be called something that was called the Washington Consensus, which you may have heard of. It's sort of an unfortunate name because it's not something that necessarily emanated from Washington. It was a description of the policies adopted by most of the governments in the hemisphere and supported by the World Bank and the Inter-American Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and others. And most of the elements of the Washington Consensus, even though it's sometimes vilified, are in place, as Jeff suggested, in many of these countries. That means essentially balanced budgets, very careful monetary policy, to keep inflation down, because inflation is the most significant tax on the poor in any country. If you can control inflation, you're doing more to benefit the poor people of any of the countries in Latin America than almost anything else. I mean, in Brazil, when Cardoso came in there as finance minister and put in the Real plan, the disposable income available to the poorest people in Brazil jumped almost immediately 20%. So you keep inflation under control by good fiscal and monetary policy. You have floating exchange rates, so you don't get yourself locked into protecting an exchange rate, which requires all sorts of distortions in your economy and all sorts of pressures on your entrepreneurial class and on your workers, et cetera. There are several other elements of the so-called Washington Consensus. It was never fully implemented anywhere. There are some countries that say they did it, like the Argentines. Not really true. They implemented parts of it, but not all of it. But most of the countries still subscribe to those objectives. As President Uribe of Colombia told a group of us in New York a few weeks ago, before he was reelected, he said, look, you can't let the words Washington Consensus pass from your lips, but all of us are implementing the various pieces of it. So just don't call it that. Deal with each of the pieces as you can individually. Thirdly, I think there is a commitment to dealing with poverty and a recognition that the countries absolutely must deal with poverty if they're going to have the kind of countries they want with continued political stability. And David has been on the forefront of that in handling it masterfully in Bolivia. But more than that, if you're going to have modern economies, you're going to have modern, well-trained, well-motivated, healthy labor force. So you've got to invest in health and you've got to invest in education. And just today there was an article that I received about how the Brazilians are trying very hard to become another IT center. And in fact, when I was down there not too long ago, I spent a lot of time in Brazil, but I was down there not too long ago and talking to people from Motorola. They're doing certain kinds of things in Brazil even more cheaply than they're doing in India, which is rather interesting. And the Brazilians are trying to deal with this, trying to take advantage of this, but they have a long way to go and they certainly have to improve their educational system. So you've got to focus on dealing with poverty. How do you deal with poverty? Nobody really knows exactly how to deal with poverty. There are a lot of experiments. One of the most interesting ones right now, you see it in Mexico, you see it also in Brazil, is to give cash to poor people, just outright cash to them in return for some kind of commitment to some kind of objectives. And in Brazil, it is to have your children in school and certified being in school in grammar school. And if you can certify that, then you get a certain amount of money. And the World Bank has just done a study of these programs, and there are some of them in Asia, but most of them are in Latin America, a couple in Africa. And the tentative conclusion of the World Bank is that these things actually work. These are an effective way to start to break the cycle of poverty and the tradition of poverty, get people a little bit beyond where they've been, a little more disposable income, and also help get the next generation out of the trap that they find themselves in. So these things are taking place in Latin America. And I think we should not despair that not all the problems have been solved. And I think that what David is talking about this effervescence of democracy, of poorer groups having much greater say in their political systems, is very, very positive from the point of view of the United States. Sure, there are going to be things that we don't like happen. Sure, people like Daniel Ortega are going to be elected again as president of Nicaragua. But that's fundamentally the Nicaraguans' problem. The context, the global context in which all that takes place now is much different from the context before the Cold War ended. The concern the United States had about the internal workings of the politics of Nicaragua back in the 70s and 80s was driven largely by a Cold War dynamic which does not exist anymore. So we should not, in my view, be as upset that, that Daniel Ortega has come back into power in Nicaragua. From the point of view of U.S. foreign policy, we can be concerned about what he might do in terms of policies and how they will affect Nicaraguans, but that's not the same as being concerned about what he would do that would directly affect the interests of the United States. And I think that it's interesting, as was pointed out before, that you have someone like Lula in Brazil. I mean, of all of the leaders, maybe only Evo has greater claim to being a real legitimate member of the lower working class, has battled his way up to become a president of a country. And yet when he got there, he realized he had to continue the conservative economic policies of his predecessor, and the country has been in pretty good financial shape. It's not growing fast enough, however, and now that he's reelected, he's going to have to try to stimulate growth, and that's going to mean redirection of the state's spending away from large bureaucracies and towards greater investment and in infrastructure and things. So one of the points I'd like to make, at least in these initial remarks, is that the United States, as it looks towards Latin America, shouldn't be looking at it trying to do the kinds of things that it used to do in the past. We do not have to be as deeply involved in trying to manipulate, manage, influence the domestic politics of the countries of Latin America. Many times in the past it didn't work anyhow, but and we did it probably clumsily, and maybe we even have the wrong objectives. But now there's no real reason to do that, in my view. We ought to be working on a couple of other things. One, from the point of view of the United States' interests, it is very important that our neighbors to the south have strong, viable economies that employ their own people and give their own people a chance to realize all their hopes and dreams within their own countries. Now, we can help that only to a certain extent. We can work to help them with governance issues, which is a fundamental problem in many of these countries. But I think we should be doing that on a more multilateral way, multilateral way than a bilateral way. We should be working with them to try to develop, in my view, integrated infrastructure systems. Some of that's starting to happen in Central America. The Mexicans have taken a lead in some of this in the Pueblo to Panama initiatives and others. The Brazilians are talking to their neighbors about building highways and power lines and roads and railroads and others to link them. But this is going to be crucial to help these economies really take advantage of all of the economies of scale and to take advantage of each other's qualities. Secondly, I think that we ought to be trying to think about helping these countries to the extent that we can, encouraging them to become more advanced in the technological area. That's where the future is, and that's where they can play a role. And if they don't get on the right side of the technology divide, I think they will slip further behind. And we can help do that to some extent. The last thing I'd like to say, Jeff, right now is that let's just put this out on the table now. David's a little constricted, but the rest of us aren't. You hear people say that, you know, U.S. prestige in Latin America has never been worse or lower than it is now, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you've heard that a lot of different times throughout history. I think there are we should be concerned about that, and there are some reasons for those difficulties, but I think they can all be overcome. I would say, frankly, the policy of the current administration toward Latin America does not differ very much from what we were doing, you know, in the Clinton administration with the Summit of the Americas, and that built on what the Bush administration had done before. We basically continued that, and that came out of what the Reagan administration was doing. So there's a long continuum here of focusing on the kinds of things that we've all talked about here.
I was struck as Alec was talking. It brought to mind the way we sort of shorthanded U.S. policy toward the hemisphere in the 80s, when there was a lot of stuff going on in Central America. There was the hope for some change in South America. We sort of said our policy was democracy and development and defense. Now, the Cold War was still very much alive at the time, so that defense thing could mean things like traditional military security, but we all knew that in parentheses and underlined, drugs. So it was the 3 Ds, one way or another. I just went on the State Department website, which I do from time to time because I really miss the place, to see Tom Shannon.
It misses you too, Tony.
To see Tom Shannon, who is the current Assistant Secretary of State, holding forth at the awards for conservation, American corporations who have contributed to conservation in the hemisphere. And he was saying that today's slogan is basically democracy, prosperity, and security. So it hasn't changed all that much in the 20 years that we've looked at it or lived with it. I wanted to say something about some of Jeff's points and the others as well. In the late 80s, and particularly right around 1990, I was in Chile and living with the transition from the dictatorship, the military government of Augusto Pinochet, to something different, where in an act of pure democracy, in a plebiscite carried out by that same military government, the citizens of Chile said, we want to have elections now. We think it's time to see whether you, General Pinochet, stay, or civilians or someone else takes over. It was a very exciting time because we saw those kinds of developments happening. Next door in Argentina, there was a change of government, again brought about through an electoral process. And as a result of those changes, they were occurring elsewhere, there was this push towards reform, the development of the Washington Consensus, if you will. What I think we learned after I left Chile and got back to Washington, and we began to analyze as the mid-90s approached, the reforms had sort of slowed down, and the word that we often used, or the words we often used, were reform fatigue. You got the democracy, you got the elections, and those were all being carried out pretty straight, and there wasn't too much going wrong there. You had the privatizations, that is, the selling of government entities to private enterprise who were presumed to be able to run them better. But there was another level that it didn't really get hit, and that was real institutional reform. The justice system, the tax systems, how are the governments going to run? And it was handled differently by different countries. I think Chile probably went furthest down the line in carrying these out. They did make changes to their judicial system. They have worked and worked assiduously at trying to make sure that revenues are brought in. By gosh, they even put in new things for Chile and much of Latin America. They put in anti-lobbying laws, which is a rare beast down there. That didn't happen next door in Argentina. Today, if you want to do business in Argentina, the last thing you want to have happen is some kind of a disagreement that might carry you into the judicial system. And because you just don't know what's going to come out. Judges are still bought and sold. That happens elsewhere. So I think there's another level that didn't happen, and that plagues the region. We, the U.S. government, have had programs to try to help countries deal with that. I guess my view is that they were good programs, in many cases well thought through as to content, but they were our programs that we tried to put into the other country, and it was viewed that way. So to the extent that nobody likes somebody else telling them what to do, this was a case of the United States telling country X, country Y, what to do and even how to do it. And I'm not sure that that has always been well received and hasn't served us terribly well. It also, where they did make an attempt and it didn't carry through, if it failed, it might also have brought us a little bit of opprobrium, a little bit of blame. I'm struck by, again, as Jeff says, the press reporting about how the peoples of this hemisphere in their electoral processes, and there have been, what, 7 or 8 elections, or will have been 7 or 8 national elections in the hemisphere by the end of this year. That many have been going on. How much this is yielding people who might or might not be people the United States would like to see in office. Well, if you look carefully, it's really not all that disturbing. As Jeff said, when people thought that Lula da Silva would come in and would be a leftist kind of person. I've read recently some analyses that impressed me and made me think about our own elections here, just completed, our off-year elections. I don't know how much or how many of the votes that were cast were really ideological votes. I think that we had major changes in our Congress because a lot of people just didn't like the way things were going and wanted to see a change. And I think if you take the reality of large deprived portions of populations, the indigenous, the poor, and the others, who realize increasingly that they can have a say and who have someone calling for their votes who says, I'm going to make a change, you may not be seeing any sort of a big ideological shift in any of these countries, left, right, center, or otherwise. You're seeing people who are dissatisfied, who want to see change, and I think, David, someone like Evo Morales now has a real challenge. He's got to deliver on the promises, the populist kind of promises that he's made, or he may soon see so much of that support evaporate or shift. He doesn't have the protection, if you will, that all those petrodollars give Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez is using the money from the oil that Venezuela sells to basically shore up his own political strength and to keep himself in power. I think Jeff can comment on whether or not he's really doing anything to change the economy and to improve the long-term conditions of Venezuelans, and that's something that I think we ought to talk about.
I think there are many things that have to be done by an embassy. First and foremost is protecting the lives and welfare of American citizens. And we know that on any given day, there are literally millions of Americans traveling around the world, and a fair number of them get sick, some die, some find their way into prison, some find their way into political uproar. And one of the embassy's job is to protect them. Another is to assure a level playing field for American business. This doesn't mean trying to seek advantage, but to at least ensure that American businesses who want to trade or invest are not prejudiced against. Another job that we have is to try to get other countries, other governments, to support our points of view on international issues, whether it's votes in the United Nations, whether it's our concern about building a strong international consensus on the fight against terrorism. Another thing that we should be doing as a nation, that we do as a nation, is promoting institutional change in some countries, making their judicial systems less corrupt. Now, Tony has said that this doesn't often work. Maybe we have different views. We have a number of tasks. The embassies are there not just to be there, they're there to do things. And I'd like your views on, in your own experience, as you view others, are we doing enough, and are we doing it well enough? David?
Well, again, going back to some of my own history with Bolivia, back when Alec was the deputy chief of mission and Paul Boker was the ambassador, Jimmy Carter was the president, and Jimmy Carter was pushing human rights. I remember the reaction in Bolivia was, what are you guys doing? Telling us that we have to, or we should. I guess what I would say is we should not interfere in their politics, but we should press the principles of democracy. We were talking a little bit about popular democracy, what can happen if it isn't checked somehow so that it stays within the bounds of democracy. What happens when a leader gets elected and uses his popular vote to undermine institutions, to penetrate the judicial system, make it worse than it was? And democracy becomes unballasted. Well, at a certain point, maybe a democracy is no longer a democracy. And I think that, you know, if we get to that point, we'd have to say it.
Well, what do we do? I mean, is there a role for us?
Well, I think there's a role for the OAS because...
the OAS, the Organization of American States.
The Organization of American States is part of the charter. The democratic countries of the Hemisphere signed up to this, signed up to it and amended the charter to the point where if there is a subversion of democracy, in fact, the OAS can step in with a role. But again, multilateral, based on principle, and again, how the OAS steps in, what its role is, that's a different issue and something.
David, I would argue that that takes tremendous preparation of the ground. We have to be able to, both in the multilateral forum itself and then in all of our bilateral relations, it seems to me we have to develop sort of a critical mass of countries, governments, who are willing to pursue that same interest and that same end. And it seems to me that that's an area where there's still a lot of work to be done. And it calls for perhaps a quieter diplomacy than the kind that was so typical during both the Cold War and immediately afterwards, when American embassies, the U.S. government, and the voices which Jeff described, the Congress, the press, and the others, are yelling, yelling, and yelling. It seems to me, I've been watching carefully what's been going on in Chile. That is a much matured country, and it is really, truly a government of the left. The president is a socialist, and she succeeded a president who was a socialist, and a center-left coalition has governed Chile since 1990. It does not present any threat or hazard to the United States, our values, our interests. In fact, Chile can be is an excellent partner. But I've been watching our current ambassador there go through a very difficult diplomacy of trying to make sure that the Chilean government knew, understood, and to the extent was able, could identify itself with our interest regarding the UN Security Council seat, which was just filled in New York, because there was some serious concern that for reasons of regional politics or whatever, that government might support Hugo Chavez. And it was clearly a desire, it was an objective of the United States to try to prevent that from happening, to have Hugo Chavez in Venezuela have one of the 15 seats on the council. Our ambassador, from everything I could see, handled that quietly, despite provocation by the press, by the political opposition and others in Chile, could never be baited to even appear to be interfering in what was a decision. And I think he did it through the kind of dialogue, kind of conversation, kind of persuasive discussion, using all the channels at his disposal, the Chilean press, Chilean academia, business contacts, as well as government, to make sure that the U.S. view was known. There were, to my knowledge, no threats. We did not say, well, if you do this, we'll do that. It struck me as being a very effective form of diplomacy, and I think it's what's called for as we go forward in this circumstance that we now have.
Are we preparing our diplomats sufficiently well? Are we encumbering them too much? I happen to think that, you know, building these bunker embassies makes as much sense as building a wall on the border. It's a sort of simple-minded approach to a very complex problem. And yet at the same time, we make life difficult for the employees. We want the diplomats, we want to protect them. Are they getting the kind of training they need? Are they getting the kind of language skills they need? Are we doing a decent job? And I'd like your views on that. You've all seen younger officers. My view of younger officers, by the way, is that they're a hell of a lot smarter than the older officers. But
We used to be that smart.
yeah, we used to be. Somehow we were very smart when we were young, and then we just got stupid. Go ahead, Alec.
Yeah, well, I think that that is a fundamental question, and I think the State Department is addressing it. I don't think we're there yet. But some of the things we were talking about before, whatever label you want to put on it, transformational diplomacy, what have you, we have to have people with a new set of skills that were different skills than we had when we came into the Foreign Service. And you have to be your people have to be prepared to talk with many elements of society. Because of the proliferation of the democratic process in virtually all the countries in our hemisphere. And you have to have your people out there talking to them, understanding the issues in a clear fashion so they can. And one of the things I'd like to stress is that one of the most important things that the United States can do for Latin America is open our markets. I didn't mention trade just because I thought I'd gone on too long, but I think getting a trade arrangement so that our markets are open to people in Latin America, where virtually 60% of the exports from Latin America come into the United States one way or the other. And if you want to have entrepreneurial societies with new investment, new businesses, and employment for people and jobs for people, they've got to have access to this market, as well as other markets. And our job is to try to do that. And I have to admit, I'm a little concerned that with the election of the other day, that we may have more resistance to that. The Colombia Free Trade Agreement, the Peru Free Trade Agreement, other ones being negotiated with Panama and others that are out there. And with the particular Andean preference arrangement that goes by the complicated name of ATPDEA, which allows exports from the Andean countries to come to the United States, virtually duty-free at this point, is due to terminate at the end of the year. And there's some talk about extending it. But if we fail on that front, I think that we will set our policy back dramatically. In terms of training, I think our people need to know about these trade issues. They have to be, you can't just rely on people coming in from the U.S. Trade Representative's office and talking about them with their colleagues from time to time. You have to build an understanding in the country for the importance of free trade to the industrial sector and even the labor sectors in these countries. You need to have people who are much more sophisticated in terms of the use of the media, and in terms of simply using technology. One of the ideas is to have, this may sound a little strange, but it might work, virtual posts. That is to say, in some part of, let's say, China, you have an office, a place where people can go and they can get in touch with the embassy electronically on a periodic basis and discuss very particular kinds of issues. And you can assemble the people that are interested in that issue and put the right people on there and have them talk to those people without having to travel there. These kinds of things are something that we have to get into, it seems to me.
Okay. Final comment, David?
When I came in the Foreign Service, there was very little training. We were very little preparation for what we were supposed to do. I mean, they had something called Kanjin Roslyn in Virginia, that taught us how to go to a visa line and how to deal with different kinds of issues. And there was language training. There were those things. But the world is much more complicated for a diplomat today, and I've just been over at the new Foreign Service Institute, which is like a major, I shouldn't say a major university in terms of size, but in terms of buzz, it is. I'm thinking all kinds of stuff going on, all kinds of training available to people. Now, whether that's going to translate into more effective diplomats, I don't know. But I will say, and Alex said something like this, but these new Foreign Service officers, many of them very young, are very good, very, very good. And the way I tried to run our embassy in La Paz, and by the way, Embassy La Paz is one of the, probably the dozen largest in the world for different reasons. It's a huge embassy. But I tried to run the embassy in a corporate kind of way. You kind of get good people and let them do their work. And these people are absolutely terrific. So I am optimistic about the future. I'm guardedly optimistic about the future.
I want to just, if I can, Jeff said something earlier when he began about people who might be interested in the Foreign Service career. Let me just say that it is different today from when we came in, and the real world out there is that diplomacy is no longer, if it ever was, a low-risk occupation or profession. Neither is it a terribly comfortable one all the time. Unlike the times when we were more junior in the business, we could count pretty much on taking families, if we had them, to the post, and our kids could go there and probably go to school. My son is here. He went to school in both Mexico and Nicaragua. Today, there are 800 Foreign Service officers who are serving unaccompanied tours of 1 year. Their families are back in the States. They're separated. That is at 12 different posts. It's not just Baghdad. It's not just Kabul. You have Foreign Service officers who are out on provincial reconstruction teams in Iraq. They are very much in harm's way. So the kind of young Americans, and not always that young, who volunteer for the Foreign Service today are people who, when their eyes are open, continue to volunteer, and who do it because they feel very strongly about the country, about our values, and what it means to be an American, and they want to represent the United States of America. I think it's terribly encouraging. They are better prepared for what they're facing, both in terms of skills and I think having an understanding of what they're getting into. I still think it's probably the most enjoyable thing I could have done with my life, and I'm delighted to be able to encourage others to look at it very seriously.
Thank you all for coming. I want to thank David and Alec and Tony for sharing their insights and their experience with us. And I invite you all next door to continue the conversation. Thank you.